Thank you so much. And it's lovely to see some familiar faces. Shannon, thank you for inviting me. And Giles, happy to see you. Rush, happy to see you. And for those that I do not know, my name is Meryne Warah. I work with GreenFaith as a global director for organizing, but most importantly, I am an organizer and I live in Kenya. I'm a Kenyan. And so I am so delighted to be in this conversation today because when Shannon talked to me about it, the first thing I thought, oh, wow, this is a very good opportunity for South and North collaboration so that we get to look at loss and damage from different perspectives and different eyes. So because time is limited, I hope I'll be in a position to share my screen. I want to show you something before I say something, and then we can call it a day. Is that visible? Cool. So let's talk about loss and damage so that we get to understand what it really means. From the Kenyan perspective, this is what loss and damage means. So the first photo, I just want to do my presentation in forms of photos so that we see as we get to also understand what it means. From the scientific perspective or the scientific definition or climate change definition of loss and damage or English definition of loss and damage is that loss is for you to lose something and damage is what it does to you, be it financially, be it emotionally, be it spiritually. So this photo comes from one of our major pastoralist communities in Kenya. This place is called Marsabit County. They're largely pastoralists. That's all they do. So what happens is that this was after a very long period of drought. It prolonged more than they expected it to do. And since they don't have alternative source of income, of course, they had to walk long distances looking for pasture for their cattle, walk long distances looking for green vegetation so that their cattle can survive. But when they were still on their journey, it started raining. So when it started raining, the humidity that came from the soil and the water and their body temperatures could not adapt as fast. You would think that when it starts raining after a long distance of walking for several of days and then it starts raining, you would think that they'd get relief and their cattle will not die. But the opposite really happened because there was an imbalance in the way that everything was happening in the soil, in the atmosphere. It hit them so hard that they started dying. So this is what happens in the pastoralist community, especially these pastoralist communities in Kenya. When they sell one donkey from the pastoralist communities, one donkey is an equivalent of, say, 800,000, just one. That is an equivalent of 800,000. So if they lose them to this magnitude, so we want to see how loss and damage will depict itself. If they lose them to that magnitude, then it means they have completely lost everything, culture, their livestock, their economic livelihood, because this is the same thing that they get and get it back to the economy of the community. So the discussion is, when this happens in a pastoralist community, that depends on their animals and depends on the vegetation to be green, depends on water so that they can survive. And it's also their economic value. At what point do you separate loss? And at what point do you separate damage? And at what point do you talk to such a person so that they don't experience the loss, but only experience the damage? And at what point do we ask the government to do the compensation? And this is where it gets interesting, because the government says we cannot compensate because it is an act of God or it is an act of nature. And so compensating a community or one person who has lost thousands of donkeys, thousands of sheep, thousands of goats does not become my business. And so when the government says it's not their business, and also financing bodies say we cannot finance loss and damage, as it has been the conversation among the COPs that we've attended, because they are saying there's no difference between loss and damage and adaptation. So if that is the conversation, then where do you put this community that has lost everything that they depend on? It is their way of life. And the animals also, the cattle, the camels, the goats, the sheep, need the environment to be conducive for them to continue living as the pastoralist community. So when our government says we cannot pay that because it is an act of God, and then the climate change financing institutions also say we cannot pay loss and damage, and then again go back and pay adaptation because the two are the same, where do these people go? And so when it hits close to home, this is where it becomes more painful. So this is a community that has been for years and years and years been displaced because of heavy floods. When you're looking at that house, I hope it is very clear. Down there, there's nothing, but this is where they live. They cannot go anywhere because they don't have another alternative land to go and live in. So this is the state of their house, and this is the state of their living condition, and they have to get clean water. Don't forget that the clean water is also very hard to come by, because during flood, when it moves from section A to section B, it gets into the river, and there's no time to rehabilitate the river to make the water clean enough to be able for consumption. But this is what they do. So they live in these conditions, and they still drink the dirty water. And this is a grandmother and her grandchildren and her daughter-in-law after the son ran away. So we look at loss and damage from the perspective of the elderly, from the perspective of the children, and from the perspective of the women. In the African context, the man has an option of running away and starting afresh in a different place, but the woman doesn't. How do you run away from your children? You have to stay there. And so the mother has to stay there and take care of these kids. And so it loss and damage kind of disrupts even the SDG of education. In this point in time, these children will not go to school because there's no place to go. So and when they decide to come from this living condition and come to church, Giles, I wonder how much these people will listen to the sermon when they come from this place and they come to church. I wonder how they will concentrate and listen to a sermon, knowing very well that probably they didn't eat the other night, or probably it was so cold because the houses are pretty much not houses, they did not sleep. And here you are speaking about hope and love. It is very difficult for them to understand that. So this is the same grandmother, and this is their toilet. When I went here to talk to them, it was very difficult to have that conversation and see them in that state and see children in this state. So I kind of ask myself, this is a video, I don't think, I really don't want to play it, but I kind of ask myself, at what point do faith communities take loss and damage from this perspective and argue it from this perspective? In other words, putting a face to the damage, putting a condition to the loss, and then saying adaptation has nothing to do with the loss and damage, because this is double tragedy. You've lost and you're damaged spiritually, emotionally, and everything else. So I think that faith communities need to start speaking holistically and say that loss and damage is no longer a conversation of politics and liability and finances. It's a question of human dignity. It's a question of way of life, sanctity of life, because I do not know what dignity it is to live in such a place. In this place, there's no dignity anymore. And so the values of Christianity, the values of Islam, the values of Hinduism, the values of religious teachings or spiritualism should be first and foremost speaking about human dignity and making sure that somebody is safe, making sure that somebody has a place to live, making sure that somebody has, hope, which is very important. So for me, when I talk about loss and damage from a Kenyan perspective, I talk about loss and damage in this form, not loss and damage in terms of agriculture and food security. I talk about loss and damage in a holistic way, you know, looking at gender rights, looking at the right of children, looking at the right to go to church or to worship in a mosque, looking at the right to go to school for children, because I do not know how much hope these children have at the end of the day. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then end in a minute by saying that faith leaders and faith communities should join their voices when you're talking about loss and damage, but not talk about it from the perspective of science or the perspective of politics or the perspective of being right with the forces that might be. But I urge faith communities to talk about loss and damage from the perspective, is it human? We have a beautiful concept, which most of you probably have heard about, called Ubuntu. Ubuntu, or mtu, is a Swahili word meaning human. And Ubuntu means, in no uncertain terms, being human. So for faith communities, our conversation should be different. It's not about you need to finance loss and damage. It's about we need to make sure that people live a dignified life that provides the holistic way that allows somebody to live with hope, because it's very difficult to have a hope when where you're living talks about doom. Thank you so much.